Hello there everyone, and welcome to the much anticipated Conquest guide for Smite. This video is going to take you through pretty much everything you need to know to get started in Smite's premier game mode. There are many aspects that are constantly in play in every single match of Conquest that you are going to play, but just remember, even after you have finished watching this guide, the only way to truly get better is to practice what you've learned in-game, and then to keep asking questions to clarify that understanding. That being said, let's start diving into this. I have divided this Conquest guide into many separate parts, each of which will be labeled and timestamped in the description down below. That is enough of a startup sequence though. Let's start a discussion by talking about the overview of Conquest as a whole. The object of Smite's Conquest game mode is to destroy the opponent's Titan. In order to do this, players will need to first work together to take out the towers and phoenixes scattered across the map, all while leveling up your god and building items to further your success in your given role. But what roles exist in Conquest? Well, let's figure this out and discuss this next. There are 5 roles in Conquest. I will probably do a more in-depth guide for each of these roles in the future to further everyone's understanding of each role. But for the purposes of creating a basic understanding, the roles in question are as follows. Support. Part of what I will be calling the front line of your team. This teammate is typically the guy that is setting up the team and protecting the mid laner and ADC. ADC. The all damage carry. This character is all about doing damage with auto attacks. These auto attacks will be used to destroy towers and other objectives quickly throughout the map. Mid laner, another damage carry. This character is all about doing damage in high bursts. Ability damage is the name of the game for your mid laner, using high damage items and abilities to decimate your foes. Jungler, a hybrid teammate that can either build into full power or defense. In Season 5, typically junglers are building into damage, but the focus of the jungler is to attack lanes and farm all of the camps that exist in the jungle. But we're going to cover camps more later. Solo laner, the second half of the front line. This character is all about diving the enemy team's mid laner and ADC with their tanky builds to stop them from doing the damage they want to do comfortably. Keep in mind that all roles in this game are equally important. Smite is a team game, and that is especially true within Conquest. Work together as a team. If you do not, you will lose. When you are first starting out in Conquest, you want to stick to learning one of these roles as a main role, with another 2 or 3 secondary roles that you also understand and can play. On top of this, in those roles, choose 2 to 3 gods max that you are going to learn for those roles. A common mistake I see new players make is trying to master every single god. Stick to 2 to 3 for each of the roles, and get comfortable and effective on those gods before trying to expand your pool of characters. If you are looking to get better at certain roles, it is way more beneficial to learn specific gods in those roles than to do the role with every single god. My advice is to pick 2 to 3 strong gods in each role and learn them inside out. Now that we have an understanding of the roles in the game, let's talk about the map and where these roles go in the current state of the game. So, when we are looking at the typical map, we can divide it into 3 separate lanes. The lane in the middle of the map is called the mid lane. The mid lane is where your burst power character, the mid, will be getting the majority of their experience and farm. From there, we have 2 more side lanes. The side lane where the towers are farther apart is known as the duo lane. The duo lane is where both teams will typically place their support and the all damage carry, at least for the beginning of the game. Finally, we have the side lane where the towers are closer together. This is known as the solo lane, and this is where the solo laner will be getting their farm. Shocker. Now, apart from the lanes, everything else is known as the jungle. This is where the jungler will be roaming around and getting experience and dropping buffs for the rest of their team. But what kind of buffs are we talking about? Well, let's go through the map bit by bit and talk about what kinds of things we can find when we wander away from the safety of our lane. In Smite, there are 4 buff camps for each team. But on top of the 4 buff camps, we also have 6 experience only camps. Of all of these experience camps, 2 of them are considered to be neutral due to their positioning on the map. It is important to remember that the experience values that these camps give throughout the game does increase the longer the match goes on. But anyways, let's talk about buffs. Blue buff. This buff gives the wearer heavily increased mana regeneration, as well as 10% cooldown reduction. This buff is given to the solo laner. Speed buff. No, this is not yellow buff. Speed buff increases the wearer's movement speed. This buff is typically given to the jungler. Red buff. This is a power buff. The wearer of this buff gets increased power for a duration of time. This buff goes to the mid laner, but late game this buff could also go to the hunter. Purple buff. This is not the same purple buff that exists in the arena. In Conquest, this buff creates an aura that lowers the protections of the enemies around the wearer. This buff is typically given to the support. It is important to remember that all of these buffs have a 2-minute cooldown, with the experience camp having cooldowns ranging from 1 to 2 minutes as well. I will be covering a good jungle route in another video, but for starting out, just keeping track of timers is a very good place to start. Now, outside of the camps, we also have 3 major jungle bosses that we are going to cover here. The Gold Fury and Oracles. The Oracles are the harpies that exist outside of the Gold Fury pit. Killing both of these harpies gives your team a ward that cannot be destroyed that specifically covers the Gold Fury pit. The Gold Fury itself is a boss monster that will take most of your team to kill, especially in the early game. If your team gets the last hit on the Gold Fury, everyone on your team will receive a major sum of gold that you will be able to immediately spend. The Pyromancer. The Pyromancer is located right outside the Fire Giant pit. It is another monster that will take your team to kill it. Upon this creature's death, your team's fountain will receive a buff. That upon leaving your fountain, you will receive a movement speed increase for the next 14 or so seconds. The Fire Giant. The Fire Giant is the most difficult jungle boss to kill in Smite, but it is by far the most rewarding. Upon this creature's death, your whole team will receive a buff that gives everyone the following effects. First, you will get health and mana regeneration, a major power buff, and increased tower damage for an extended duration of time. Now, let's move on once again and talk about the phases and the flow of a typical Conquest game. In general, the flow of a typical Conquest game can be divided into 3 separate phases: early game, mid game, and late game. The transition from phase to phase is never going to be the same in each match that you play, but I do have some general points to make about each phase of the game. Stay tuned, because as with everything else I am covering, more in-depth coverage of these phases will come in future videos. Early game. The early game of Smite is from the moment that you first spawn in to about 10 to 12 minutes into the match. In this phase, every role we have previously talked about sticks to farming in their lane and gets their buff when it's made available to them. The fights that take place in this phase are small in scale and are most likely initiated by the jungler. Mid-game. I personally believe that this phase of the game exists from 12 to 25 minutes. During this phase, most players are about level 12 to 15, and fights are more prevalent and much larger in scale. Rotations, which we will cover later in this video, are constant, and team fights are occurring around the major objectives in the game. I will touch more on this in more videos, but make sure you are turning these fights into objectives. This will make your lead grow faster. It is always important to get kills and then continue to grow your lead. Use the advantages that you get. Late game. Typically after 25 minutes of match time, this phase is also the shortest phase unless you're going into a really long game. Fights are massive, stakes are high, and team fights are pretty much always around the Fire Giant. A team wipe at this phase pretty much spells out the end of the game. In my opinion, late game Smite is the most fun. Now, to end the first phase of this Conquest guide, I do want to touch on rotations, communication, warding, and the importance of gold. So let's move into that now. Rotations are always one of the hardest things to hit on and to explain, but here goes everything. Rotations go hand in hand with communication. If you are playing ranked, then you will have the luxury of using voice chat, but otherwise you will be stuck using VGS. Regardless, you are going to have to communicate rotations in a few different situations. First, you will need to call out if you see that the lane mate you are fighting against is missing. If your lane mate is missing, you are responsible for calling out missing and which way you saw them run if it is at all possible. Typically, if you do not see an enemy's direction but they are still missing, I would call missing twice in a row. Second call is to make sure that you are going to tell your team if you are ganking. You have to let your team know so that they can help you set up for a successful gank. Calling out your intention will smooth out the transition and get everyone further ahead. Third, if you see the enemy jungler. The jungler is not bound to a lane and is thus the most threatening person on the map. If you see them heading towards one way or another, calling that lane to be careful is never a bad thing. As a general rule, it is always better to over-communicate than under-communicate. Now, for the most pressing and frequent question that I get, when is the correct time to rotate? And to answer that, I first want you to picture that our map is actually divided into two sides. And go figure, it is. If the enemy is on your side of the map and they are either trying to gank or dive your towers, or maybe even stealing your buffs, then you want to try to rotate to that fight if it means that you won't lose more experience. In the early game and the mid game, experience is the most important thing. That being said, be sure to call out your intentions. The last thing you want to do is bait your team into a fight that they thought you were going to rotate to. It is not wrong to call out to your team, give that buff up, I can't make it there, I need to farm. But just know if you do that time after time, you will fall further behind as a team, so you want to try and keep control of your lane so that you're free to rotate to these fights. That being said, if the enemy is on your side of the map, and they are overextending, and overextending is a common mistake that I see a lot of new players make. Overextending is basically going onto the enemy's side of the map without any help. That is why I say if you see a single enemy on your side of the map, you should rotate to it. They are out of position and your team should be able to successfully put them down. The only time that I say you really have to rotate is if your team is about to fight on a major objective such as the Gold Fury, Fire Giant, or Pyromancer. You want to be at that fight to help out. Just make sure that you are being safe as you travel through the jungle. There are different ways that we can do this. Smart pathing and warding. Each lane has to ward. Each teammate has to ward. No one likes warding, but trust me, it is very important if you would like to win. I will cover each role in particular in the future guides, but let's cover some general stuff for this section. You want to ward the paths that you know the jungler and your lane opponent enjoy taking. If you have that vision, you can be safe in the jungle. Otherwise, you want to play scared. It is better to play scared and survive than to play cocky and die. The common thought that I always have, that I suggest you start thinking as well, is who can I see on my minimap right now? If you can see everyone on the enemy team on your map, then you can obviously be way more free to walk wherever you want. Otherwise, you have to be very careful. That being said, if it's only 5 minutes in the game and you can't see the enemy solo laner, it may or may not be the end of the world, but it is always better to be safe than sorry. Finally, I want to talk about the importance of gold. The main difference between Conquest and the other game modes in Smite is the amount of gold that you will be getting throughout the map. Spoiler alert, gold is a lot harder to come by in Conquest. You can get gold through the lane minions and the jungle camps. Just remember that gold numbers change in two given circumstances. First, the gold that lane minions give is drastically cut if the minion gets hit by a tower. Second, the gold lane minions give is increased if you can get the killing blow on the minion. Gold is very important because gold is used to buy wards and, more importantly, your items. Building is the most important part of Smite, and building intelligently is crucial. You cannot build the expensive luxury items that you are used to building in Arena and Joust. You just won't have the money for it. Do your homework and research how to build the gods you are looking to play. My channel does such a video about once a week, so hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with those kind of things. Now, that is really all I have to say for the overview and basics of Conquest. Next time I have one of these talks with you, I will be discussing the role of your choice in depth. Let me know in the info card above what role you want me to start with, and I will do an in-depth guide for it. Anyways, that is really all the time that I have for this video. If you enjoyed watching, hit that like button and share this video with a friend. I hope that I answered your questions, but anything that you want covered in the future, be sure to leave it in a comment down below. Regardless, this is Keltick, signing off. Have yourselves a casual day.